Alright, making a physics video, I believe. Yeah, just sort of want to encourage that sort of thing. Hythloday made a video talking about the different interpretations of the evidence, and that's what they are. They're interpretations of the evidence, right? Regarding the two-slit experiment, regarding the wave feature of the dynamics of light's interaction with the world. Quantum mechanics, to some extent. Pretty much to all extent. And quantum mechanics, or quantum electrodynamics, is basically a description of the interaction of photons with something, electrons mostly. And so, you know, when these physicists are talking about these interpretations, they're basically saying, how do you interpret the evidence and explain the dynamic, the function, the behavior. So clearly there's this superficial similarity, association, likeness, regarding the creation of what's called the interference pattern, and it duplicates or mimics or has the common features of the mechanics of waves as they interfere with each other constructively and destructively, moving through a medium. And so there's often this attempt to construct an interpretation of the evidence that in some way parallels or is consistent with wave dynamics in mediums. Now there's no medium that we can detect in space, the universe. Clearly it seems clear that photons will travel from point A to point B in a straight line, displaying there's nothing in the medium itself causing any disturbance. And the argument must be made that photons essentially are creating a disturbance as they do travel, and that that disturbance is so broad that it can be captured in two slits, two separate funnels, two separate, what's the word I'm looking for? Gates, separated by a lot of distance compared to a photon, and you know, that they will interfere with each other like going through a medium, that their disturbance of the space around them is so broad that they will encompass both slits with that disturbance and interfere with their own disturbance, and to create a pattern somehow through that process also convert back into a result that, unlike wave dynamics where the energy is actually spread out, the photon's energy will only go in one spot. And again, you know, it just can't be, you know, you can't go too close to the analogy, because the destructive interference in medium waves can't be duplicated in any other kind of electrical dynamic or energy dynamic, because you can't destroy energy. You can't take two things that are energetic, combine them into something that's non-energetic. You can't destroy energy. So you can't have two photons that would destructively interfere, because they are constituent, fundamental energy possessors, and they can't be destroyed. They can't be neutralized to no happening. Can't happen. So that there's something steering. And so then these interpretations basically come up with ways of saying the actual photon is riding on waves, like a surfer or something, and the pinball machine of its deciding where it actually ends up on its surfboard, through this whole variety of possibilities, is narrowed to an inevitability, through the mathematics of the wave dynamic and its probabilistic outcomes. You're still stuck with the fact that even in water waves, even in waves in a medium, the creation of the disturbance, the creation of the vectors that will decide probability, is happening at the slit. It isn't happening as the wave propagates. What decides where the probability will end up is the slits. That's where it's happening. And you could argue, I think you rationally, reasonably argue, sensibly, logically wonder where the diversity comes from, where the capacity for there to be the range of the narrowed range of probabilities are established at those two slits if they're doing nothing but just being two slits. If they're putting no energy into the system, no variation, no variable, then you would argue that I think you would tend to believe that the probability would be somehow mathematically related to the area of the slit material in terms of its circumference, in terms of a probabilistic encounter with some proportion of it. And I don't think you'd have enough in that alone to create the product. But it's possible there's enough variation in the intensity of proximity, how close a photon is to the material of the passage it's going through will decide its direction. Now, sort of a related concept to this is Thunderfoot's been messing around in a couple of videos, although I don't think much of Thunderfoot as a human being. This little bit of science is interesting about this. There's obviously some static electricity. There's some electrical charges that fluids acquire as they move through different streaming devices, as they're forced through something under pressure or even without pressure, even just moving through the atmosphere. They acquire charge, and they can rather dramatically, as molecules, move in that charged environment. And there's a substantial deflections in outcome, in direction, in pattern can be created by just bringing other material objects with different charge in proximity to the fluid. The same thing is happening at the slits. One could argue that the matter of the slits, the electrons that are exposed at the surface, are charged, and that charge is deflecting the photons, creating a pattern. And one could argue, sensibly, that in any of these interactions, that a tiny deflection, at any point, a tiny change in some sort of parallel movement would have dramatic effects in terms of its size. The tiny tiny fractional angle can have a very big impact in terms of its product relative to distance. So the further the distance, the broader the consequent difference, displacement, maybe it's a better word, divergence. So a tiny change can create a dramatic change. So you change a little tiny change in angle creates a broad change in terminating point, or whatever you want to call it. And I would argue that's probably happening in the two-slit experiment. And but the point I wanted to get to, I haven't got to, is he also, Hythloday mentioned harmonics a little bit. And once you get into frequency, that's what we're talking about really, right? In the two-slit experiment, one of the things that should be understood is it's a frequency experiment. In waves, it's also a frequency experiment. You're talking about the period of the waves and also whether they are in harmony. It's not something done often, but you theoretically could create two waves that have a different, that are out of sync. And that would create a distortion in the interference pattern, because now the interference wouldn't be as mathematically coherent, because they're out of phase to start with, and that their phase changes aren't going to be the result of established distance. Certainly would change the focal point of patterns at different distances. You would have different patterns. You won't have the same pattern at each distance, just further and further apart, if they're out of phase. So anyway, but that, just bringing up the word frequency, is relates to this subject, because you have to understand that the atoms, again, you know, if you're going to analyze or interpret the two-slit experiment and the dynamics of photons as they interact with electrons, you have to concede that that's what they're interacting with, electrons that are usually associated with atoms. And you know, that's sort of like being a scientist, is recognizing that the two slits aren't made out of something solid. They're made out of, like all matter, they're made out of stuff, and that stuff has its own patterns, its own harmonic frequencies. It's jiggling, it's vibrating, as Feynman would say, jiggling. And it can be doing that vibrating or jiggling. Like everything else, it can move very fast. The speed of light is its only limitation in terms of how quickly the jiggling can be taking place. And under that circumstance, one could argue that atoms could be jiggling at frequencies that are quite high in terms of the period of their displacement. Can be very rapid and can have a distance, you know, a magnitude that would be equal to the wavelength of the light itself. So theoretically, as a photon might have a period between the photons, a distance. The distance the atoms could be moving can be just as great as that period. So they could be rather dramatically, from a photon's point of view, moving, creating an obstruction or changing in terms of how the photons will be able to interact. So one could argue that in a photon, a stream of photons of some particular wavelength, consistent, 400 nanometers, whatever, 500, if the atoms are vibrating at a similar frequency, one photon could interact with the electrons of the atom when it's at its, you know, furthest displacement, and the very next photon could be interacting with the atom at its least displacement. But clearly, what can be happening is that as the atom, if I use this hand to indicate the atom's movement, it's from furthest right to furthest left in terms of its vibration. Clearly what could be happening is the photons are interacting, one photon, if a photon hits it at its furthest point, the next photon in the wavelength of light could do nothing, at best would maybe at 3/4, and the next one would be at 0 at its furthest left point. So you could create the very shape or the idea of a patterned outcome in terms of having only a limited number of possible trajectories based on the fact that the interaction is always going to take place at those intervals. Whether they're in sync or not wouldn't matter. The distance of change in the placement of the atom will always be the same for the wavelength of the light, and so therefore, no matter what sync they're in, your pattern, if your light is coming at a consistent frequency, I mean, as if the light is like this light right now is coming down at me at 60 cycles a second. I don't see it. I don't see the on-off. I just see photons, and they look like they're coming down all the time, but they're really only coming every 60 times a second. There's a little, burst of them, and if the light has a consistent burst as it's going towards the two slits, if you have a light source that is all in phase, then there's the rational probability that the movement of the atoms would create a consistent pattern in terms of filtering the interaction, filtering the product, where it would only be 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 0, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 0. It would follow a clock cycle dependent on the frequencies of the two things, the period of the light and the period of the atoms vibrating into the light, creating the interference pattern. So the interference is really being created by the mixture of these two frequencies, the period of the light being consistent and the period of the atoms being consistent. Now, so another way of saying what I'm saying is that an interesting experiment might be to have light sources that are not consistent period, that aren't in sync. So to have multiple light sources that aren't on 60 cycle, the same 60 cycle electricity isn't creating the light. So there's no consistency in the point in the wavelength, and this, doing the two-slit experiment under that circumstance, creating out of sync light, might well destroy the interference pattern and demonstrate that what I just said is correct. Yeah. So I think that's that's where I want to take the conversation. But I just don't like this word interpretation. Seems a silly way to say theories, a function. That's what they are. They're theories regarding how it happens. They're not interpretations. They're interpretations of evidence, and we don't call evolution an interpretation of evidence. The evolution interpretation. We don't say something like that. The survival of the fittest interpretation. So I'm just saying it's a strange way to describe what is speculation regarding the dynamics, physical mechanics, the mechanics. Interpretation is a strange way to describe mechanics. So that's all that was really here. Is there's different theories regarding how the how this element of a wave function manifests itself physically, and why it exists. And again, I think a big part of the answer to why it exists is being discounted by most physicists, because they seem, even though this seems like kind of obvious to physicists, should be, they seem to have forgotten that matter isn't a stable, consistent thing. That matter is a universe in itself. It is a thing made up of pieces, and those pieces have a dynamic themselves, that they interject something into anything they interact with. They're not passive. The slits are not a passive participant in the two-slit experiment. The electrons in the slits are moving. The atoms are moving, and those moving parts are discounted from all the analysis I've seen. I haven't seen a single physicist talk about the dynamics of the material the photons are interacting with when they're creating this wave interference. I've seen nothing, no conversation about it whatsoever, as if it even exists. They even talk like they think photons actually reflect off of surfaces and they actually bounce, when I think we know theoretically that's not possible, that they are entrapped, absorbed, and readmitted, but that they don't reflect in the classic understanding of that word. So, anyway, that's probably enough. So yeah, I don't really, it's very hard to have a conversation about almost anything with Hythloday, but he's the only one talking physics, so let's talk physics now and then. It would be nice. It'd be just nice to have somebody who was reasonable, because the comment section is not reasonable. They're yeah, they're just useless to the conversation. Yeah, so yeah, so I'll be, I have to make the follow-up videos in the continuation of my the related ambition of mine to get physics on what I think is the correct interpretation, the theory of function, which is that Einstein was not correct. Space is doing nothing, and the only thing doing something in the entire universe, the only thing doing anything, is photons, and everything else is just a manifestation of photons and their capacity to be caught in spirals. So there's photons moving from point A to point B in a straight line at the speed of light, and there's photons caught in circular patterns. That's the only two kinds of thing there are in the universe, and everything else is just a manifestation of what happens when you put trapped photons and lock them together, pretty much. So anyway, till the next time, thank you very much and such.